so let's start a lecture on the integumentary system. One of the 11 organ systems in the human body is called the integumentary system. And it's basically a one-organ system. Okay, your skin is the one and only organ in the integumentary system. Seems like that's kind of crazy to have just a whole system that is just one organ. But it does happen to be the largest organ in your human body. If you consider your skin one thing as a whole, it is the largest organ in the human body. If you ask a typical person that, they're probably thinking of one of the abdominal organs, usually the liver, which is the largest in the abdominal cavity. But everyone has somewhere around 20 to 25 pounds of skin on their human body. Okay? Skin is very tough stuff. We make leather goods out of animal skins. And one of your experiences, we're going to dissect the cat today. You're going to get a good look at what skin looks like. One of the big advantages of looking at the integumentary system right now, too, is you're going to see that skin is an amazing marriage of an epithelial tissue and a major connective tissue, too. So we're going to be able to review and look at and talk a little bit about tissues as well as we talk about this. So this is a very appropriate system to deal with right here. The picture that you're looking at now is the picture that they use of the skin from your textbook, and this is very, very helpful. When you look at the skin, you'll see that you should first identify three major sections to it. The very surface up here is, of course, an epithelial tissue. Anybody remember it from last time? What type of epithelial tissue is that? Stratified, not cuboidal. Stratified squamous. Remember the surface cells, if they're flat, if they're cuboidal, whatever the surface, the mature cells are, that's what identifies that. So in terms of the skin, we call this part of the skin the epidermis. We call it the epidermis. But in terms of what tissue is it, we say it's stratified squamous. The layer just below that is connective tissue, and this is the part we call the dermis. So I have epidermis and dermis. As we go along, we're going to try and highlight certain little bits of words that you're going to see again and again and again. And if you know these little bits, it's going to help you. Like the little term epi. If you see epi at the beginning of a word, it means on something. It could be like your book and your notes are on the table. It could also mean like that chart is on the wall. It literally means on the surface of something. So it could be on the surface of the wall or it could be on the surface of the table. Your clothes are epi. They're on your body. They're on the surface of your body. Now, let's get technical here. Okay, you want to make sure you understand this technicality. The epidermis and the dermis together are what we call the skin. There is a third layer down here that we're going to talk about that isn't technically considered the skin. We're going to include it in our integumentary system because this third layer attaches the skin to the body. Okay? This layer down below is called the hypodermis. And again, here's another little prefix that will help. If you see the word hypo, doesn't mean a needle, right? What does the word hypo mean? It means below or sometimes less of something. It has that quality of less than, either less in height or less of concentration. If you're hypothermic, some of those people that landed in the Hudson River, had to go to the hospital, they had become very hypothermic, which means low body temperature, right? So hypodermis literally means below the dermis, right? Very simple. So there's a layer of tissue down here below the dermis. Again, we don't consider this to be skin, okay? These really make up what we would call the skin. So let's review too what kinds of tissues then are involved here. We already said that the epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium, right? What is the major tissue component here in the dermis, though? The dermis is what makes the skin strong, tough. What tissues did we talk about that are very, very tough? Connective tissues. What kind? Collagen. Yeah, exactly. This is dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Okay, dense, right? Densely woven fibers. What does irregular mean? Do you remember? It means all the fibers don't go the same direction, like in a cord. They're woven into a sheet, and your skin is like a sheet, right? So the fibers run many different directions, and they are the tough, strong collagen fibers. And again, you'll see an example of that in the cat. What about the hypodermis? The hypodermis is also connective tissue, but this is areolar connective tissue. This is that main loose type. Okay, and my skin is held loosely to my body, isn't it? I can pull my skin up and away, and it'll spring back. Okay, because my skin is held in a relaxed way to my body. This is a weave, if you remember, a weave of elastic and collagen fibers, but it's kind of a loose, haphazard sort of arrangement. And you will see this in the cat. As we cut through the skin, we need to then pull the skin from the cat's body, and we can pull it. You can't take the skin and pull it apart because it's tough, but you can pull the skin off the body because you're just going to break these fewer number of little fibers as you do. This is going to look kind of like spider webs to you. Now, it's going to look kind of like spider webs. So we have these major tissue types that make up each one of these three levels. And this is kind of a great review of what we've just talked about with connective and epithelial. All right. So here's our three tissue types, or our three sections to this. Now, within each one of these sections, there are some other kinds of structures. What we just did was we named the major tissue that forms this. But if you look down here, you see a lot more than just areolar connective tissue, don't you? Yeah. Okay, and if you look at the dermis, you see a lot more stuff going on. In fact, the dermis here is the active part of the skin. The epidermis is just a barrier, basically. It's just a boundary. It's trying to keep all the moisture of your body in and keep the dry microbial world out. But this is the active part. And a lot of people just take their skin for granted, but it's got many functions to it. If you go to your textbook and look at the list of functions, there's a lot going on in your skin. And you can pretty much gather what those things are by looking at these other structures in here. We want to define or name 4 major types of structures that are embedded into this dense connective tissue. So maybe the first and the most obvious one that we'll label right there is the hair follicles, right? All of the hairs on your body, whether they're long and you can see them like on your head, or the little tiny ones on your arm or other parts of your body, all of the hair follicles are embedded and anchored down into the dermis. down into that tough connective tissue. You can cut the hairs off at the top, but they just keep growing because they're growing from deep within the skin. These are part of temperature regulation. One of the major functions of your skin is temperature regulation in your body. And for the most part, they help trap little bits of air around near your skin to help insulate you. They can also function at times as little sensitive. Hairs can catch vibrations that can be felt through the skin. So there's some of that. So hair follicles are here. We also see glands here. There are glands, these little coiled tubes that you see here, or the little ones over here alongside the hair follicle. Sweat glands are here, oil glands. Sweat glands are a part of temperature regulation. If you pour fluid onto your skin and that evaporates, it carries heat away from you. When you're in a very warm environment, you tend to sweat because it helps to cool your human body. You always feel better when you're wet and it's hot than if you're dry, or at least most of the time, unless it's really, really humid outside. But you also have some oil glands that pour oil up onto the surface to try and keep all these dead skin cells kind of stuck together a little bit and keep that outer boundary of your skin whole. An oily surface to your skin is going to let less things come through than a dry surface would necessarily. So we've got several glands, several types of glands there. We also have blood vessels. You can see there's some big, large blood vessels down here in the hypodermis, and they've kind of drawn them in here, but they really haven't drawn them as rich as they really are. There's just tons of blood vessels through here. And of course, all of these things, these glands, hair follicles, all the rest, need the nourishment of the blood, but the epidermis does too. Remember, epithelial tissues are avascular, right? They have that symbiotic relationship where the connective tissue is providing for their nourishment. So, if you cut through the epidermis up here, right, you don't bleed. If you cut down into the dermis, then you bleed. And the fourth thing that we would recognize here are all the sensory nerves. Of course, one of the most important things with our skin is for us to be able to sense things about our outside world. And there's a variety of things we can sense. We can sense temperature, right? We can sense whether our environment is hot or cold through our skin, and there are special nerve endings for that. There are other special nerve endings for pain. There are other special nerve endings for touch. Like nerve endings that can sense temperature can't sense touch. You've got separate ones for each thing. So if I just feel a light touch on my hand, that's certain nerve endings. I also have nerve endings for pressure. I always thought, what's the big deal if you can feel that there's pressure against your skin? It's not so much that as when you grab something. If you grab something and lift it, you have to be able to squeeze with a certain amount of force. And it takes less force for some things. If you pick up something delicate, you don't want to crush it. You have to be able to feel how much pressure you're applying to something when you grab it. And that becomes an important part of you being able to handle and manipulate things. So there's a whole variety of sensory nerve endings in the skin that provide that sensation. So the skin is a major sensory area. It's a major temperature regulation area. It's kind of like the radiator of a car, right? In order to produce movement in your automobile, you take gasoline and you burn it. You explode it in essence. And that creates a lot of heat. So you have passageways in your engine and you run water and antifreeze through it. But that has to run to the radiator and let off all that excess heat so that the engine doesn't melt down. Same thing in your human body. In the summer, your body opens up these blood vessels and gets heat that's carried in your bloodstream out to the surface of your body so you can radiate it away. In the winter, if you're out in a cold environment, your body will shut down these blood vessels and try and keep blood flowing deep in the core of you. It's got to let some blood flow to the surface, but not as much as it normally would. So it's using the skin of your body as a radiator, like your automobile would. Okay? So those are the four major sort of structures embedded in that dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Now down here in the hypodermis, it's much simpler. This is just basically the link between your body and your skin. But there are a couple of things that we would want to recognize here. One would be, of course, marbled into that areolar connective tissue is adipose tissue. Right? And you can see it marbled in and through there. Whenever you find loose connective tissue, that areolar type, you're going to find adipose, either in tiny little bits or in quite a bit. In fact, most of the fat in your body is where? It's right underneath. No, it's right underneath your skin. Okay? There is a lot of talk. If you look at the news, there's a lot of talk these days about belly fat. You're going to see that later. You do store some fat inside you here. But most of the fat on your body is stored just under the skin in this hypodermic area. And then, of course, just the other major thing here would be the blood vessels, these major blood vessels that are crossing and feeding into the skin. One of the things that I want you to do, I want you to pay attention to as you're skinning your cat today, is as you pull the skin off, we're going to cut down the middle of the back here. And as you do, as you pull the skin away, you're going to see regularly spaced blood vessels. The cats that we're going to dissect have been processed for us by a scientific company. And if you love cats like I do, you don't have to worry about it. Nobody raises cats for this purpose, right? How many cats are put to sleep in the pounds of America every day? You know, thousands and thousands of cats get euthanized. So nobody raises cats for this purpose, but there are companies that then go to the pounds and take these cats and then preserve them for us so they don't rot. But the other thing they do is they inject a blue dye and a red dye into their arteries and veins so that we can see them. The cat's body is small and the blood vessels are small, and sometimes they're hard to see or find without the dye in them. So they put dye in their blood vessels for us. And you will see when we pull the cat's skin away and you look right down the back, you'll see these regularly spaced blood vessels. And actually right there with the blood vessel is a little nerve and a little vein. The veins never seem to get any blue in them, but you can always see a little white cord and often a little red, looks like a little tiny thread, but they're just regularly spaced. And what they're doing, those are the ones that are going out into the skin. And if you even pull up the skin and look on the underside, sometimes you can see the little web-like pattern of arteries running into the skin, like you would see right here. So look for that when you're dissecting today. So these are major elements that you would find in these various layers. Okay? The epidermis is just basically the epidermis. Okay, now we said the skin here is so interesting because it's this marriage of an epithelial tissue and a connective tissue. And this picture sort of shows that in a little more detail. There's a couple of things for you to note here that are very interesting. First and foremost, here's a picture, a microscopic picture of the epidermis and the dermis. Now, in the prior picture, they made the epidermis look pretty big and the dermis look pretty small, right, just so that you could see everything. But what often happens there is you get this idea that the epidermis is like this and the dermis is like this, and here it is in reality. See how much epidermis there is? It's just the tiniest little thin layer over all of this connective tissue. So you tip, like with the cat, when we skin the cat, if you look at the edge where you've cut, you'll see all this epidermis. You really can't, you'll see all this dermis. You really can't see the epidermis because it's just this thin little layer. Even though this is many layers thick, cellularly, many, many, many cell layers is still microscopically thick in a sense. Also, you should note, you can see up here, if you look at this picture up above, in fact, let's look at that in a little more detail here. If you look at it here, notice that the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis is not flat and straight. If that were the case, it would be a lot easier for it to come apart. If you rubbed your epidermis back and forth very much, the two might slip apart. Instead, you have this sort of wavy line where they're connected. We call these little bumps in the dermis there, we call them dermal papilla. Okay? The word papilla, it means like a little nipple. So it looks like you've got all these little nipples there. But it makes a much, much tighter bond between the two. It takes a lot of work to separate those two layers. Not that that doesn't happen. Right? Have you ever done something manual where your hand rubbed and rubbed and rubbed against a tool and a little bit later you found you had a blister? Ever had a blister? Right? That blister, it just, all that has happened is the epidermis has come apart from the dermis. The two have come apart, and so now fluid fills up in the space between the epidermis and the dermis. And so you get this little bubble of epidermis pushing up off the surface of the dermis. But typically, in most cases, that doesn't happen. It takes a lot of work to make a blister. So that wavy appearance there is a part of how these two interface. The other thing you should know is any sort of change in this dermis is going to be reflected to the surface of the skin. The epidermis is so thin that anything that happens to the dermis can be seen through it. Like, I don't know if you have any scars. I've got some scars on my hand from when I was a kid, and they're still there. Scars are not in the epidermis, they're down in the dermis. Right? If you cut and you bled, you've cut down on the dermis. If you've got two edges to the dermis that have been cut apart, and then they just heal back in some odd sort of pattern, then you're going to be able to see where that was still on the surface. Plastic surgeons know how to take those two edges and meet them. They know if they get the dermis together fine, the epidermis will grow over and you'll never know there was a problem. You won't know there was a cut there. But you've got to get that dermis together. Dermis is also what causes your fingerprints. Right? Have you ever seen fingerprints with the little whorls and little lines that go everywhere? All those little ridges of a fingerprint are down in the dermis. Okay, instead of having these little bumps, what you have are little ridges that run underneath here. And the epidermis then just lays over it. So all the sort of shapes and scars and features that you can see that makes one part of your skin different from another is going to be in the dermis itself, right? All surface contours of your skin are formed down in the dermis. The dermis is the major part of your skin. I think another thing that's interesting about the dermis and all the fiber, although we say that the collagenous connective tissue is irregular for the most part. We have this cross weave of collagen fibers. There are, though, some distinct directions for most of the fibers in any sheet of connective tissue. And as you look here, you can see that there are certain patterns of connective tissue. And this then applies again to sort of a plastic surgeon. most surgeons, when they're going to cut beneath the skin, know that this is the pattern of fibers, and if they cut in one way, it's going to leave less of a scar than if they cut in another way. If you cut across the major fiber and then try and bring it back together, the chance for all those little ends meeting just right and making a smooth heel is not as good as if you cut lengthwise between the fibers, right? And then the fibers here just kind of come back together and heal back together this way. So this pattern of collagen fiber in the skin, and this is going to be a basic pattern. This may vary slightly from person to person, but there are some major patterns to how those fibers run in various areas. So the dermis is really where all the action is in the skin, right? Now, we've talked quite a bit about the dermis, the hypodermis, you know that. Let's look at the epidermis in more detail now. Okay, we're going to look at this dense, we're going to look at this stratified squamous epithelium. Dead cells at the surface, active, living sort of cuboidal cells. There are 5 layers that we want to know within the epidermis. Should be able to label and know kind of what's going on in each one of the 5 layers. Now, I should qualify this by saying most of the skin on your body only has 4 of these layers. There are a couple of special places where the 5th layer is also present. So I'm going to start by highlighting the 4 layers that are found in most of the skin in your body. And let's start right down here at the bottom. Do you see the wavy appearance here? See the dermal papilla? See, this is the lighter area here is connective tissue. The darker area is epithelium. So see how this goes like this? See how you get that undulating? That helps bind the connective tissue and the epithelial tissues tightly together. But let's start here with the bottom one, which is the stratum basale. Okay, so let's point out this layer here. The deepest layer, the layer that's right against the connective tissue, is what we call the stratum basale. The word basale is like the word base. The base of something is always at the bottom, isn't it? This is the basal layer. Now, we talked about this when we talked about epithelial tissues. All the other layers come from here, don't they? Every other cell that you see here was multiplied down here. The number one job for the stratum basale is to make all the other cells in the epidermis. Its number one job is reproduction, and that's all it does, really. The cells here never really have time to grow up and do what they need to do. Now, there are 2 types of cells found in this stratum basale, and you should know these 2 types of cells. Most of the cells in the stratum basale are what we call keratinocytes. Okay? Keratinocytes. And basically because, sorry? Can you see it? Keratinocytes. And basically what that's saying is these are cells that produce a protein called keratin. Keratin is a tough protein that gives the skin, that gives this epithelium substance. Otherwise, those dead skin cells at the surface would just be little tiny bits of dust when they're done. But they're not. They have a real substance to them because the cells produce keratin. Now, the cells in the stratum basale, although they're keratinocytes, they really never have time to get their factory running because all they're doing is multiplying. That's all they're doing is just multiplying. But the other cells that you see here get to grow up to be mature keratinocytes. We'll talk about that in a minute. So they're producing a protein that makes your skin tough. The other type of cell that you find here in the stratum basale are the melanocytes. Melanocytes. Now, these cells produce the pigment, the material, the substance that colors your skin. One of the 8 cells that you were studying as we studied the various organelles of the cell, one of those 8 was a melanocyte. And you could see within it little vesicles, little dark vesicles of melanin that the factory of those cells had produced. Now, we know that the basic color of your skin, if you're out in the sun, your skin color can change, can darken or lighten or whatever. But the basic skin color you have is due to the number of melanocytes embedded down here in the stratum basale. If you have a darker skin color, you have many, many, many melanocytes there. If you have a lighter skin color, you have very few. People that are albino have lots of melanocytes, but they're malfunctioning. They don't produce melanin like they should. So you can have tons of melanocytes, but if they don't work right, then you'll look like an albino. But if they're working right, then obviously the more melanocytes there down at the base, the darker your skin color. So the stratum basale is this mix of keratinocytes and melanocytes, mostly keratinocytes. Now, the next layer up is the stratum spinosum. Okay, so let's look at that one. Stratum spinosum. This is where the cells go that the stratum basale makes. So you might want to describe these as like teenagers. Okay? They're not little babies like the stratum basale. All that the stratum basale is, there's never time to grow up because they're just multiplying. These now are starting to grow up. They're starting to ramp up their factories. They're starting to produce keratin. There may be a couple of cells here that might be multiplying still. Sometimes there's a little remnant of a cell or two may divide still. But most of these cells are now beginning to get their factories up and running to produce keratin. Question? Yeah, most of the cells here are just getting up and running and producing keratin. Okay? Melanocytes don't multiply in numbers. If they ever do, things go really wrong. Okay? When people have skin cancers, there's 2 kinds of skin cancers. You can have skin cancers in keratinocytes. It's usually not that big a deal because keratinocytes multiply a lot anyway. These typically aren't malignant, dangerous kinds of cancers. You don't want to get them. You want to get them at an early stage, but they're not that malignant. Melanoma, when melanocytes go wrong, then they can become malignant and they can infect all sorts of parts of your body. Very, very dangerous because these guys don't multiply typically. Their job is to just sit down at the bottom and produce melanin. Melanin isn't meant to just color your skin. It's actually a sunblock, right? It's a sunblock. It's like a natural suntan lotion. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet rays that are coming into your skin. If the ultraviolet rays get into the dermis, they can create damage. Sunburns hurt because of the damage they create in the dermis. If the UV radiation can come through the epidermis, it can damage down here. And your skin will get sort of red because the blood vessels are opening up to try and bring healing, to try and fix it. But melanin is just that natural block to that. And if you get a suntan, if your skin gets darker than it is normally because you've been out in the sun, it's just that UV radiation has stimulated the melanocytes to produce more than their share of melanin. And they can even export it out in the spaces between the other cells. Sometimes if you just have a brief bout in the sun and then you come back in, you'll get that layer of melanin here, and slowly but surely that melanin works its way to the surface, and then one day you see it all kind of peel off, and it's gone. So if you're out in the sun constantly, the melanocytes are constantly producing melanin, and so you've got a great big thick layer of melanin all the way through all these other layers, and so you have plenty of sun protection then. But it's when you don't have very much protection that the sun penetrates through. So I don't see melanocytes up here. I may see melanin embedded between the cells, but these cells up here are now all keratinocytes, and they're getting up and running. Now, once they do their thing, once they've gotten even farther away, now these cells here in the stratum granulosum, these cells are older now, and they're old enough, in fact, they've been producing keratin for so long that I can actually see granules of keratin in the cytoplasm. And so we call it the stratum granulosum because I can see those granules. It's sort of the darkest layer right there. Now this tissue has been stained, so don't think that the granules function like melanin. The granules are actually transparent. Keratin is transparent. But they look darker here, and you can see that distinct layer, the stratum granulosum. These three layers are the living part of the skin. All the cells here are living, although the ones at the stratum granulosum are old enough now, and they're far enough away from the connective tissues that they're not getting a lot of moisture, they're not getting a lot of nutrition now. They're right on the verge of being dead. And when they do finally die and dry up, it isn't like there's nothing left. There's still all this keratin protein, and so the outermost layer, which is called the stratum corneum, you see it way up there. Stratum corneum is the dead skin cell layer. And the skin cells still have a toughness to them because of the residual keratin that the cells have been producing. I bet you always wondered why all the products in the skincare section of the drugstore called carry this and carry that, right? Got this carry lotion and that carry lotion, and it's because this major protein here is keratin. So I've got these three active layers: production, beginning the process of producing keratin, and then this mature keratin production, and then the dead layer. The layer that I skipped here is the stratum lucidium. This fifth layer is only found in some skin. There's certain skin on your body that is very different from the rest of the skin on your body. Where do you find the biggest difference in the kind of skin? Yeah, bottom of your feet and the palms of your hands, right? Palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. You have less melanocytes here, don't you? There's not so much pigment in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. And what we know is that the skin goes through a change from the granulosum, goes through a change, and there's a layer called the stratum lucidium before we get to that corneum. It makes the skin thicker. And you'd recognize that the skin on your hands and your feet is thicker, right? It's a little more pliable. And I've tried to look up a lot on this, and there isn't a lot of detail. This hasn't been a huge research topic. It's not like we're trying to cure cancer or something. So I'm not sure a lot as to, the keratin apparently goes through another sort of change. And this may be due to the fact that there are a few melanocytes here, so maybe the chemistry of this is a little different, and so the cells go through a last change before they become corneum. So just be aware that that one layer is only present in those two sites. Okay, how are we doing? We good? Look down your handout there and see if there's any little points on there, any details that I missed. That should be all the basics. If you go to your textbook, you're going to find all sorts of information on your fingernails and your hair and all of that. We're not going to go into that detail. Just focus on the things that I've presented today. Yeah, Leslie. I could. If you saw a picture like this, you should be able to label the different layers. I'm not saying I will, but that's in the realm of possibility. Or I might just describe one of these layers, right? If I said something about mature keratin production, where you can actually see the keratin in the cells of this layer. Granulosum, of course. Right? If I'm talking about the layer that reproduces all the other layers in the skin, in the epidermis, stratum basale, right? So make sure you have a basic idea of what each one of those layers are doing. Make sure that you could identify them within the picture. You've got all these pictures in your textbook. We okay with that? All right, good.